Week 2 of college football is in the books. It's been a few days since Saturday, but one of the major news points has been one of the new Heisman frontrunners, and that is Ashton Jeantry. Ashton Jeantry has had a monster first 2 weeks of the year. Boise State has looked pretty good for a smaller school, and people are catapulting Jeantry up to the top of their favorites for the Heisman winner. Now, I personally think he's still behind at least Quinn Ewers and Jackson Dart, but I do get the case for Ashton Jeantry. But in this video, I'm going to break down how realistic is it for a running back from a small school to win the Heisman. So let's look into it. So in my opinion, the biggest barrier for Jeantry to win the Heisman is the school he goes to, Boise State, but more specifically, being in a group of 5 conference. I looked at every single Heisman winner and where they went to school since 1960 to see if they were from a big conference or a small conference. Now, looking at the conferences can be a little difficult because there's been a lot of change in the past 50 years. But looking at the schools here, there are some that stand out. Now, BYU is currently in the Big 12, but when the guy won the Heisman, they won. So they were a smaller conference school. You had Lamar Jackson winning it out of Louisville. Now, Louisville was in the ACC when he won it, so this doesn't help Jeantry's case. But they were only 2 years into the ACC, so maybe you can give them a half point for that. But they were still an ACC school. And then other than that, Navy having 2 Heisman winners in 63, and it was either 61 or 60 flat that won the Heisman. So really there's only 3 schools that had a Heisman winner when they were in a small conference. Every one of these other schools were in the SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, Big 10, or the old Southwest Big 8, which joined to make the Big 12, or the Pac-12. So that is the major barrier for Jeantry, is we don't see players from small schools win the Heisman. It just doesn't happen, as you can see, 3 times since 1960. The next barrier in his Heisman hopes is the running back position. Now, I honestly thought in my mind there had been more running backs to win the Heisman recently, but there hadn't. So I looked at the last 5. And that actually goes back to 1998, where the 5th one was. So we had Henry in 15, Ingram in 09, Bush in 05, Dane in 99, and Ricky Williams in 98. So looking at just their stats, nothing with their team, nothing with their conference, there are some minimums that they have to cross. They need to be crossing or just under 2,000 total scrimmage yards. So obviously 3 of the 5 had over 2,000. Ingram was 8 yards away, so we'll call that a 2,000. Dane was the only one that was a little bit off. As you can see, he contributed nothing in the receiving game, but Jeantry's not really doing that either. So I don't really think we can just be like, Jeantry will get that. 2,000 yards has to happen. And then for touchdowns, he needs to be, in my opinion, above 20. Now, I know there was 2 guys that didn't get 20. But again, this is a guy who has to make up ground because he's playing for such a small school. So we had a 28, a 20, an 18, 19, and 28 touchdown seasons. Those are total touchdowns, not just rushing. So Jeantry also needs to have over 20 touchdowns. So to me, he needs to have over 2K total yards and 20 touchdowns in order to even be considered for the Heisman. Now, looking at Jeantry's stats, so far for rushing is 45 attempts, 459 yards, and 9 touchdowns. And then receiving, he only has 5 catches, 12 yards, 0 touchdowns. So he's pretty much been out of the receiving game completely, but he's been dominating on the ground. Now, if we take his per game stats and just assume he's going to keep this pace, honestly, he'd win the Heisman because it would be the best season ever. But he won't continue this pace. It's just impossible. Now, his rushing, I think he could eclipse 2,000 yards if they continue to give him this many attempts. So right now he's averaging 229.5 yards per game. That's a lot because he's basically averaging 10 yards per carry. So that would end him with 2,754 rushing yards on the season. And then if he continues just having a couple yards of receiving per game, he's looking at just above 2,800 total yards. Now, I don't really think he gets that high. If he could finish between 2,200 and 2,500 rushing yards, which again would be an incredible season, a historical season, but that's what he needs in order to come over this hill. I think he could do it if he just continues to get the attempts. Now, the touchdowns are clearly going to regress. Right now, he's averaging 4.5 touchdowns per game, with 9 on the season after playing 2 games. So he's on pace to score 45 rushing touchdowns. That's not going to happen. But if he can have one of those Derrick Henry, Ricky Williams seasons where he can get 25 to 30, or if he can somehow eclipse 30 total touchdowns, and that he might be able to get a catch or 2 receiving touchdowns on the goal line. So if he can get past that 28 mark, if he can pass 30, that's the kind of season he needs to win the Heisman in this situation. So I don't think his touchdowns are going to fall off for sure, but if he can just keep it above a 30 pace or even a 25, 28 pace, I think he puts himself in a position where it's possible. His last barrier is his schedule. Now, his schedule is perfect for him to get those stats he needs. But one of the things that a Heisman always has is statement wins. Now, normally they can come at a couple times throughout the season because they play multiple, at least decent teams. Boise really only plays one team that stands out, and they did play them last weekend. Now, Jeantry had an amazing game, and it definitely helped his Heisman status. But if they were able to beat and knock off Oregon, that would have really excelled his season. Even if they go undefeated, they're going to look at the season and be like, yeah, he played great against Oregon, but he just beat up on a bunch of small schools. Even if he dominates, even if he gets the stats, he goes undefeated the rest of the way with Boise, the schedule will hold him back. And going undefeated is something that I think he has to do in Boise as a team with him carrying the load in order to stay in this conversation. Because if they start losing random games, even if he's still rushing for 150 to 200, 250 yards, 2, 3, 4 touchdowns per game, they're just going to say it's empty. He's not winning. Boise needs to win because they're already at a disadvantage being such a small school and such a small conference relative to these other Heisman hopefuls. I think in order for Jeantry to have a Heisman chance, 1, he needs to continue to load up on his stats. He needs to get over 2K rushing yards, maybe even 2,200, or total yards at least. Even if he stops rushing more, he needs to catch the ball more. 2, he has to get over 25 touchdowns, maybe even over 30 touchdowns. 3, Boise has to go undefeated the rest of the way with him still carrying the load offensively. And 4, Boise has to be the playoff team that comes out of a group of 5 team conference. Now, team success shouldn't matter in this state, but it does. And while what they do in the playoffs won't matter because the Heisman is a regular season award, if Boise can be the one group of 5 team to make it to the playoffs, just riding Jeantry's rushing, just him carrying them on his back, it'll add the narrative to him being the best player in the country. So Boise has to make the playoffs. So in the end, looking at the history of the Heisman, there's only been 3 small schools or schools from small conferences. We saw what it takes for running backs to win the Heisman, only 5 since '98. And they had insane video game number stats. Jeantry can get there, but it's going to be a battle. You can't have any off games, and they also have to dominate their schedule. I love Jeantry. I think he's so good. I even came out with a way too early 2025 NFL mock draft, and I only had 1 running back going in the first round. And I talked about 3. I talked about Ollie Gordon, Jeantry, and Judkins. And I said they were all kind of even to me. I did go Judkins just because I don't think Jeantry's receiving game is enough, or he's shown enough to get picked in the first round. But his rush, like what he's doing right now, he'll be a first round pick, even with how the position's been treated in the NFL. And I wish I would have put him in my 2025 fake mock draft, because I would have looked like a genius seeing this season come into place. But in the end, I don't think he wins the Heisman. I think Quentin Ewers is going to lead Texas to a top 5-4 seed. They might win the SEC. And then Jackson Dart is going to lead Ole Miss to a season they haven't seen in who knows how long. Those two, to me, are going to put great numbers on better teams in the hardest conference of football. And Jeantry will not be able to pass them for the Heisman. But who knows?